The last case of the day. Judge Nathan Hale sat alone in his chambers, the quiet ticking of the antique clock on his desk, marking the end of another long day. It was a small luxury amidst the relentless grind of the legal system, a quiet moment to reflect before the final case. He leaned back in his leather chair, the weight of a long docket pressing on his shoulders. The day had been grueling, filled with cases ranging from petty thefts to complex property disputes. Yet the last file on his desk promised a straightforward hearing, a routine speeding violation. The folder bore the name Tom Reed and detailed a charge of driving under the influence paired with excessive speed. A simple fine and probation, Judge Hale thought, glancing at the clock. The hands crept toward 4:30 p.m., signaling the closing moments of his workday. The courtroom was a quiet sanctuary when he entered, its polished wooden benches bathed in the soft glow of afternoon sunlight streaming through tall windows. Lisa Carter, the court clerk, was already seated at her desk, tapping away at her keyboard as she prepared for the hearing. The hum of cleaning staff echoed faintly from the courthouse corridor as they tidied up for the night. Taking his seat behind the bench, Judge Hale adjusted his robe, a practiced gesture that helped him settle into his judicial role. As he reviewed the case details, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed down the hall, breaking the courtroom's stillness. The door burst open, and a disheveled man stumbled inside, clutching the hand of a small girl. Both looked out of place in the solemn environment. The man, Tom Reed, Judge Hale presumed, was dressed in wrinkled clothes, his face flushed and his demeanor anxious. The little girl, no older than 8, had pigtails and clutched a small frayed backpack. Her wide, apprehensive eyes darted around the room, taking in the imposing figure of the judge and the sterile surroundings. "Sorry we're late, Your Honor," Tom said, his voice breathless. He tugged the girl forward, his grip on her wrist firm, almost too firm. "We had car trouble on the way here." Judge Hale set his pen down, his sharp eyes studying the man. "Mr. Reed, you're fortunate this is the last case of the day," he said, his voice measured but firm. "Punctuality is a sign of respect for the court. Please ensure it doesn't happen again." Tom nodded quickly, his eyes darting nervously toward the girl, who stood silent beside him. "Of course, Your Honor. It won't happen again." "Your daughter?" the judge asked, his gaze softening as he looked at the girl. "Yes," Tom said. "This is my daughter, CLA. Say hello to the judge, CLA." The little girl hesitated, her eyes flicking to her father before returning to the floor. She mumbled, "Good evening, Your Honor." "Good evening, CLA," Judge Hale replied, offering the gentle smile. "It's nice to meet you." The girl didn't respond, her small hands fidgeting nervously with the hem of her dress. Judge Hale's practiced eyes noted her discomfort and the tension in Tom's posture. Years on the bench had taught him to read people, and something about this pair felt off. "Let's proceed," Judge Hale said, clearing his throat. He began outlining the charges. "Mr. Reed, you are here today for driving 85 miles per hour in a 55-mile-per-hour zone and operating a vehicle under the influence of alcohol." The arresting officer noted a blood alcohol content of 0.11, which exceeds the legal limit. "How do you plead?" "Guilty, Your Honor," Tom said quickly, his voice steady but strained. "I made a terrible mistake. I deeply regret my actions." The judge nodded, making notes. "Driving under the influence is a serious offense, Mr. Reed. You endangered not only yourself but everyone on the road. Do you have any explanation for your behavior?" Tom shifted uncomfortably. "It was a bad day at work. I stopped for a drink on my way home, but I thought I was okay to drive." As he spoke, Judge Hale noticed CLA growing increasingly fidgety, her small frame trembling slightly. She clutched her backpack tightly, her knuckles white against the fabric. The judge paused, watching her carefully. "Mr. Reed," he said, his tone firm, "the court takes these offenses seriously. Given your guilty plea, I am sentencing you to a $1,000 fine, 6 months of probation, mandatory alcohol education classes, and 50 hours of community service. Do you understand these terms? Yes, Your Honor, Tom replied, relief evident in his tone. Just as Judge Hale reached for his gavel to finalize the sentence, CLA sprang to her feet. "No, Judge," she cried, her small voice trembling, but loud enough to cut through the courtroom. "You don't understand. Dad's much worse than that." The room fell into stunned silence. Lisa stopped typing, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. Judge Hale froze, his hand midair. Tom's face flushed crimson as he grabbed CLA's arm roughly, hissing, "Enough. Sit down." Judge Hale set the gavel down gently, his sharp gaze locking onto the father. "Mr. Reed," he said, his voice measured but firm, "release her arm. Now." Tom hesitated, then reluctantly let go. CLA's eyes brimmed with tears as she looked at the judge, her small frame trembling. "He's not just drinking and driving," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He hurts people. He hurts Mom." Judge Hale's heart sank as her words hung heavy in the air. He turned to Lisa, who was already documenting the exchange. Years of experience told him this was no ordinary case, and the weight of what lay beneath CLA's words pressed on him like a physical burden. "Mr. Reed," Judge Hale said, his voice cold now, "we're going to pause this hearing while I confer with Child Protective Services. CLA's statement warrants further investigation." Tom's face twisted in panic and anger. "Your Honor, she's just upset. Kids say things." "You can't." "Enough, Mr. Reed," the judge interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. He signaled to a bailiff standing nearby. "Escort Mr. Reed to a holding area. We need to ensure the safety of this child." As the bailiff approached, Tom's defiance flickered into something more dangerous. Judge Hale didn't miss the subtle tightening of his jaw, or the way his eyes darted toward the door. This was no ordinary speeding case, and the judge realized that CLA's small voice might have just uncovered something far more sinister than he had anticipated. A whispered truth. The courtroom was emptied of its usual formalities, the solemnity replaced with a heavy, suffocating tension. Judge Nathan Hale watched as Tom Reed was escorted out by the bailiff, his protests echoing in the hallway until the door swung shut behind him. The absence of his towering presence left a void that seemed to amplify the fragile state of his young daughter, CLA. The little girl sat alone on the wooden bench, her small frame dwarfed by the vastness of the courtroom. Her pigtails drooped slightly, strands of hair escaping as if reflecting her exhaustion. Her gaze remained fixed on her lap, where her hands nervously twisted a thin bracelet, its elastic worn from years of use. Judge Hale could feel the weight of her silence, a silence that spoke volumes. Lisa Carter, the court clerk, approached him quietly, her steps barely audible against the polished floor. "Your Honor," she said, her voice tinged with concern, "I've contacted Child Protective Services. They said someone can be here within the hour." Judge Hale nodded, his eyes never leaving CLA. "Good," he replied. "Let's make sure she's not alone until they arrive." He approached the bench where CLA sat, his movements deliberate and calm. Decades on the bench had taught him the importance of presence, how to offer reassurance without overwhelming. As he reached her, he crouched slightly to meet her at eye level. "CLA," he began softly, his tone devoid of the sternness he reserved for courtroom proceedings. "Do you feel safe talking to me right now?" She hesitated, her fingers tightening around the bracelet. Her lips trembled as if the words were caught in her throat. Finally, she whispered, "I don't know." Judge Hale nodded, understanding the enormity of her hesitance. He sat down on the bench beside her, maintaining a respectful distance. "I'm here to listen," he said gently. "No one can hurt you right now. If you want to share anything, I promise to help." For a moment, silence reigned again. CLA's small breaths were audible in the stillness. Then, almost imperceptibly, she began to speak. "Dad's not. He's not like this all the time," she started, her voice so soft it was barely audible. But when he gets mad, he yells. A lot. And sometimes he throws things. Her words tumbled out in a disjointed rush, as if she feared she wouldn't have the courage to continue if she paused. Mom tries to stop him. But then he gets mad at her, too. Judge Hale's jaw tightened, though he kept his expression neutral. Has he ever hurt you or your mom physically? He asked, keeping his tone measured. CLA hesitated, then nodded slowly. He grabbed her arms, sometimes too hard. She has marks sometimes. And once, he pushed her, and she hit the table. The judge took a steadying breath, the gravity of her words settling over him like a lead weight. He glanced at Lisa, who was standing nearby, her pen poised over her notepad. She nodded subtly, signaling that she was documenting every word. Thank you for telling me, CLA. Judge Hale said gently. You're very brave for sharing this. Does your mom know you're scared of your dad? CLA looked up at him, her wide, tear-filled eyes brimming with a mix of fear and guilt. She tells me not to say anything. She says we just need to keep Dad happy so he doesn't get mad. But it's hard, Judge. It's really hard. Her voice broke on the last word, and she buried her face in her hands, her small shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Judge Hale felt a pang of helplessness, a rare feeling for a man so accustomed to wielding authority. CLA, he said softly, leaning forward slightly, it's not your job to keep anyone happy, especially not someone who scares you. What's happening isn't your fault, and it's okay to ask for help. She peeked at him through her fingers, her tear-streaked face filled with uncertainty. But what if it makes him angrier? She whispered. Before Judge Hale could respond, the door to the courtroom creaked open, and a woman in a navy blue blazer stepped inside. Her kind but professional demeanor identified her as the social worker Lisa had contacted. Good evening, the woman said, her voice warm but businesslike. I'm Marissa Carter with Child Protective Services. I understand there's a young lady here who needs some help. Judge Hale stood and gestured toward CLA. Miss Carter, this is CLA Reed, he said. She's been very brave and shared some things that warrant immediate attention. Marissa knelt beside CLA, her movements gentle and unhurried. Hi, CLA, she said with a smile. My name's Marissa. I'm here to help you and your mom. Okay. CLA nodded hesitantly, her small hand still gripping the bracelet. Marissa glanced at Judge Hale, her expression serious. Judge, has the father been detained? Yes, Judge Hale replied. But this situation clearly requires further investigation. We've also documented CLA's testimony. Good, Marissa said, standing. I'd like to speak with her mother as soon as possible. For now, I'll take CLA to a safe location where she can rest. We'll make arrangements for her mother to join her once it's confirmed she's out of immediate danger. The thought of separating the child from her mother seemed to distress CLA, who looked up at Marissa with wide eyes. Will I see my mom again? She asked, her voice trembling. Of course, Marissa assured her. We just want to make sure everyone is safe first. You and your mom will be back together soon. CLA's lower lip quivered, but she nodded, her small hands loosening their grip on the bracelet. Marissa offered her hand, and after a moment's hesitation, CLA took it. Judge Hale watched as Marissa guided CLA toward the door. Just before they left, the little girl turned back, her eyes meeting his. Thank you, Judge, she said softly, for listening. Her words lingered long after she disappeared from view, leaving Judge Hale standing alone in the silent courtroom. He knew the fight for CLA's safety was far from over. This case, which had begun as a simple speeding violation, had revealed the dark, tangled web of abuse and fear that had been hidden beneath the surface. As he gathered his papers and prepared to leave, Judge Hale resolved to ensure that CLA and her mother would not return to that house until it was safe. This wasn't just another case. It was a battle for justice that demanded more than the cold precision of the law. It required compassion, courage, and unwavering determination. Unveiling shadows. The courtroom was empty now. save for Judge Nathan Hale and Lisa Carter, the diligent court clerk who had stayed well past her usual hours. The polished wood of the benches reflected the dim overhead lights, and the gavel lay silent on the bench, its weight a stark reminder of the events that had transpired. Judge Hale remained seated, his fingers steepled in thought. The image of CLA's tear-streaked face haunted him, and the tremble in her voice echoed in his ears. This wasn't just a case anymore. It was a plea for help that the justice system couldn't afford to overlook. "Your Honor," Lisa interrupted gently, her voice breaking the silence. "I've documented everything," CLA said. "I've also noted the timestamps for the 911 call you made when the father was taken into custody earlier. CPS will follow up, but something about this case feels different, doesn't it?" Judge Hale nodded slowly, his sharp eyes narrowing. "It does," he said. CLA's fear wasn't just of her father, it was deeper. The way she hesitated, the way she looked at the door, almost as if she expected him to storm back in. She's been living in constant fear. That kind of fear doesn't happen overnight. Lisa placed a neatly typed report on the desk. "This is everything we have on Tom Reed. His criminal history is clean. No priors, no complaints. But I did a quick search on his address. It's been flagged for noise disturbances multiple times over the past year." Judge Hale picked up the report, scanning it quickly. "Noise disturbances, likely the result of his drinking," he muttered. "But that doesn't explain the bruises on Gloria or CLA's fear." Lisa hesitated. "There's something else," she said, lowering her voice. "I called the local police department to request any informal reports tied to the address. They mentioned receiving calls from the neighbors about shouting and objects being thrown, but no one ever filed an official complaint." Judge Hale's brow furrowed. Why wouldn't they? If the neighbors were aware, someone should have stepped in. Lisa sighed. "It's the same story we see all too often, Your Honor. Fear of retaliation. Or maybe they thought it wasn't their place to interfere." The judge set the report down and leaned back in his chair. "Well, it's our place now," he said firmly. "If CPS and law enforcement don't have enough to act, we'll make sure they do. But first, I want to know more about Gloria Reed. She's the key to understanding this situation." Lisa nodded. "I'll see what I can find," she said before excusing herself to make calls. Meanwhile, across town, in a small shelter on the quieter side of the city, CLA sat curled up on a cot, clutching her frayed backpack. The soft hum of the building's heating system was the only sound, a stark contrast to the chaos she'd grown accustomed to. A warm blanket was draped over her shoulders, but it did little to comfort her. Marissa Carter, the social worker, sat beside her, her demeanor calm and patient. "CLA," she said gently, "do you want to talk about anything else? About your dad or your mom?" CLA shook her head, her pigtails swaying. "Mom says not to tell anyone," she whispered. "She says it'll just make things worse." Marissa's heart ached at the child's words. "Sometimes telling someone is the only way to make things better," she said softly. "You've already been so brave today. You did the right thing by speaking up in court." CLA looked at her, her wide eyes filled with doubt. "But what if he comes back?" she asked. "He always comes back." Marissa placed a reassuring hand on the girl's shoulder. "He can't hurt you now," she said. "The police have him, and we're going to make sure you and your mom stay safe." Back at the courthouse, Lisa returned with a stack of papers and a grim expression. "Your Honor, I found some records that paint a clearer picture of what's been happening with the Reeds," she said, handing over the documents. Judge Hale took the papers and scanned them, his frown deepening with each line. Gloria Reed had no criminal record and no history of complaints filed against her husband. But there were hospital records, a series of ER visits spanning the past 2 years. The reasons listed were concerning: fall downstairs, kitchen accident, tripped over furniture. Classic cover stories, Judge Hale murmured, his jaw tightening. "No one falls downstairs this often." Lisa nodded. "The pattern is there, Your Honor. And it lines up with the time frames CLA mentioned. About 2 years of escalating behavior. Judge Hale set the papers down and looked up at Lisa. Has CPS confirmed when they'll interview Gloria? They're working on it, Lisa replied. But they're short-staffed. It could take a few days. Judge Hale's eyes darkened. We don't have a few days, he said. Tom Reed is in custody now. But without solid evidence, he could post bail and return home. We need to move faster. Lisa hesitated. What do you suggest, Your Honor? The judge's mind raced. He was bound by the limits of his judicial role, but he knew that waiting for bureaucracy to catch up could put CLA and her mother in grave danger. He stood abruptly, grabbing his coat. I'm going to visit the shelter, he said. I need to speak with Gloria myself. At the shelter's modest entrance was unassuming, but inside, the warmth of its atmosphere was palpable. Volunteers bustled about, handing out warm meals and blankets to those in need. Judge Hale was directed to a small private room where Gloria sat, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of tea. She looked up when the judge entered, her eyes wide with apprehension. Mrs. Reed, he began, his tone soft but direct. I'm Judge Nathan Hale. I presided over your husband's case earlier today. Gloria's grip on the cup tightened. Is he out? She asked, her voice trembling. Not yet, Judge Hale assured her. But I need to ask you some questions to ensure that doesn't happen. Your safety, and CLA's, depends on it. Gloria hesitated, her eyes darting to the door, as if expecting Tom to burst in at any moment. I don't know what you mean, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Judge Hale leaned forward slightly, his gaze steady. Mrs. Reed, I've reviewed the records, the hospital visits, the noise complaints, CLA's testimony in court. You don't have to protect him anymore. You're not alone. Tears welled up in Gloria's eyes, and she looked away. He wasn't always like this, she said, her voice cracking. He used to be kind, loving. But then, he changed. The drinking, the anger. I thought I could fix it. I thought if I stayed quiet, he'd calm down. And did he? Judge Hale asked gently. Gloria shook her head, a single tear sliding down her cheek. No, it only got worse. Then let us help, Judge Hale said firmly. Your silence isn't protecting you or CLA. It's enabling him. The law can only do so much without your voice. Gloria looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and hope. What happens if I speak up? She asked. Judge Hale's expression softened. If you speak up, we'll make sure you and CLA are safe. But more importantly, we'll hold him accountable. No one deserves to live in fear. For the first time, Gloria nodded, her shoulders sagging as though a great weight had been lifted. Okay, she whispered. I'll tell you everything. Breaking the silence. The atmosphere in the small room at the shelter was charged with tension, but a new sense of determination was taking root. Gloria Reed sat across from Judge Nathan Hale, her posture still guarded but her voice steady. She had made the decision to speak, and while fear lingered in her eyes, there was also a spark of resolve. For the first time in years, she wasn't alone. Judge Hale leaned forward, his expression patient and empathetic. A notebook rested on his lap, and he held a pen poised, ready to record her words. He knew this moment was fragile. Gloria's trust was a delicate thread that could snap if mishandled. Take your time, Mrs. Reed, he said gently. Start wherever you feel comfortable. Gloria's hands gripped the edges of her teacup, the warmth seeping into her palms as if fortifying her. It started small, she began, her voice low. At first, it was just yelling. Tom would get frustrated after work. His new position at the factory came with a lot of pressure. He'd have a drink or two, and when things didn't go his way, he'd take it out on me. Judge Hale nodded, his pen moving across the page. When did it escalate? Gloria hesitated, her gaze dropping to her lap. About a year ago, she said. He started drinking more heavily. He'd lose his temper over the smallest things. A dish left in the sink, CLA being too loud while playing. One night, I tried to calm him down, and he shoved me. I fell against the table and bruised my ribs. Her voice broke on the last word, and she took a shaky breath before continuing. I told myself it was a one-time thing, that he didn't mean it, but it wasn't. The next time, he grabbed my arm so hard I thought he'd break it. CLA saw that one. She cried all night. Judge Hale's grip on his pen tightened, but his voice remained steady. "Did you ever think about leaving?" he asked. Gloria nodded, a bitter smile tugging at her lips. "Of course, but every time I tried, he'd find a way to stop me. He'd apologize, promise to change, or he'd remind me that I had nowhere to go. No family nearby, no job. He made sure I felt trapped." The judge leaned back slightly, letting her words sink in. "And CLA?" he asked. "How has she been coping?" Gloria's face crumpled, and she wiped at her eyes with trembling fingers. "She's too young to understand it all, but she knows more than she should. She tries so hard to keep the peace, cleaning up his bottles, staying quiet when he's in a bad mood. It breaks my heart. She's just a child." Her voice grew firmer as she continued. "I thought I was protecting her by staying. I thought if I bore the brunt of it, she'd be safe. But today, seeing her stand up in that courtroom, I realized how much I failed her. She's stronger than I ever was." Judge Hale felt a pang of respect for the young girl who had dared to speak up despite the fear gripping her. "Mrs. Reed," he said gently, "your decision to come forward now is an act of courage. You're not just protecting CLA. You're giving her the chance to grow up in a safe environment." Gloria nodded, her resolve hardening. "I'll do whatever it takes," she said. "I won't let him hurt her, or me, again." Meanwhile, at the police station, Tom Reed sat in the small interrogation room, his hands cuffed to the metal table before him. The fluorescent lights above cast harsh shadows on his face, accentuating the sneer that hadn't left his lips since his arrest. Across from him sat Detective Marlon Hayes, a seasoned investigator with a no-nonsense demeanor. He placed a folder on the table, its contents spilling slightly. A mixture of photographs, noise complaints, and medical reports. "Mr. Reed," Hayes began, his voice calm but firm. "We've been piecing together the events of your case. You've got quite a track record of disturbances at your residence. Care to explain?" Tom leaned back, the cuffs clinking against the table. "It's called having a family," he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Kids are loud. Arguments happen. You wouldn't understand." Hayes' expression didn't change. "I've been doing this job long enough to know the difference between a family argument and abuse," he said. "Your neighbors reported hearing screams, glass breaking, and crying on multiple occasions. Care to explain that?" Tom's smirk faltered for a moment before returning. "Nosy neighbors," he said. "They don't like me. They're just trying to cause trouble." The detective opened the folder, revealing a photograph of Gloria's bruised arm. "And is this also your neighbor's doing?" Tom's jaw tightened, but he kept his tone nonchalant. "She bruises easily. She's clumsy. Falls over her own feet half the time." Hayes leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Mr. Reed, let me make something clear. We have enough evidence to charge you with domestic violence. Combined with your DUI and endangerment charges, you're looking at serious time. This is your chance to cooperate. Otherwise, I promise you, the judge won't be as forgiving as he was earlier today." Tom glared at the detective, his bravado beginning to crack. "You don't know what you're talking about," he spat. "Gloria exaggerates everything. She can't handle stress." Hayes didn't reply immediately. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, letting the silence stretch until it became unbearable. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm but edged with steel. "You might think you're in control, Mr. Reed, but let me assure you, this case is slipping through your fingers. The truth always comes out, back at the shelter. As Gloria finished recounting her story, Judge Hale set down his notebook. He could see the exhaustion etched into her features, but also the flicker of hope that hadn't been there before. "Mrs. Reed," he said, "I'm going to ensure that your husband is held accountable, but we'll need your cooperation. Will you be willing to testify?" Gloria hesitated, her fingers tracing the rim of her teacup. "If it means protecting CLA," she said finally, "then yes, I'll do it." Judge Hale nodded, his respect for her growing. "Thank you. We'll coordinate with law enforcement and CPS to ensure you and CLA are safe during the process." As he prepared to leave, Gloria reached out, her voice tentative. "Judge Hale." He turned back to her. "Yes. Thank you," she said, her eyes brimming with gratitude. "For listening. For believing us." The judge offered a small, reassuring smile. "The system failed you once, Mrs. Reed. I won't let it happen again." The reckoning. The courtroom felt different this time. The usual air of formality had been replaced by a palpable tension as Judge Nathan Hale prepared to preside over the arraignment hearing for Tom Reed. The gallery was empty save for a few officers, Gloria, and CLA, who sat close to a representative from Child Protective Services. Gloria's hands were clasped tightly in her lap, while CLA fidgeted with her bracelet, her wide eyes darting nervously around the room. Tom was led into the courtroom in handcuffs, his expression defiant. The bailiff guided him to the defendant's table, where his attorney, a young public defender who appeared overwhelmed by the case, sat waiting. Tom's confident demeanor faltered briefly when he glanced at Gloria and CLA, but his jaw set as he avoided their eyes. Judge Hale took his seat, his black robe brushing against the polished wood of the bench. He scanned the room before addressing the court. His voice, calm yet commanding, filled the room. "This hearing is to address the charges against Mr. Tom Reed, which include driving under the influence, reckless endangerment, and domestic violence. Additional charges may follow pending further investigation." Tom shifted uncomfortably in his seat but remained silent. His attorney rose, attempting to maintain a composed expression. "Your Honor," he began, "my client maintains that the allegations against him are exaggerated and that the incident in question has been misrepresented." Judge Hale raised a hand, silencing him. "This is not the time for arguments," he said firmly. "The evidence presented so far tells a troubling story. Before we proceed, I'd like to hear from the prosecution." The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Angela Rivera, stood. She had spent the past 2 days meticulously building the case, interviewing neighbors, reviewing Gloria's medical records, and speaking with CLA through CPS representatives. "Your Honor," Rivera began, her voice steady, "the charges against Mr. Reed are not only supported by witness testimony, but also by medical records and police reports. Gloria Reed's injuries, documented during multiple ER visits, are consistent with domestic violence. Furthermore, neighbors reported hearing frequent disturbances from the Reed household, including screams and sounds of objects breaking. On the night of Mr. Reed's DUI arrest, his daughter, CLA, bravely informed the court of her father's abusive behavior, prompting an immediate investigation." Tom's attorney stood again, his brow furrowed. "Your Honor, while these claims may seem damning, my client denies any abusive behavior. The medical records could be coincidental, and hearsay from neighbors cannot conclusively prove anything." Judge Hale leaned forward, his piercing gaze locking onto the attorney. "This court does not take these allegations lightly, counsel," he said. "Dismissive arguments will not suffice here." Rivera continued, unfazed by the interruption. "Your Honor, in addition to the evidence already submitted, we have testimony from Gloria Reed, who is prepared to recount the incidents of abuse she suffered. This testimony will further corroborate the pattern of violence and control exerted by the defendant." At this, Gloria visibly tensed, her hands trembling slightly. She glanced at CLA, who gave her a small, uncertain nod. Drawing a deep breath, Gloria stood and walked to the witness stand. As she was sworn in, her eyes met Judge Hale's, and he gave her a subtle, reassuring nod. Gloria's testimony. Seated in the witness chair, Gloria felt every pair of eyes in the room on her. Her palms were clammy, and her heart raced, but she knew this moment was critical. She had lived in silence for too long, and now, with CLA watching, she refused to falter. "Mrs. Reed," Rivera began, her tone gentle, "can you describe your relationship with the defendant, Tom Reed?" Gloria hesitated, her gaze flicking to Tom, who stared at her with a mixture of anger and something she couldn't quite identify. "It wasn't always bad," she admitted. "When we first married, he was kind, attentive. But about 2 years ago, things started to change. He became angry. Small things would set him off." "Can you provide an example of what would set him off?" Rivera asked. Gloria nodded, her voice gaining strength. "One night, I accidentally dropped a glass while doing the dishes. It shattered, and Tom, he lost it. He grabbed my arm and shoved me. I fell and hit the table." Rivera stepped closer. "Did you seek medical attention after that incident?" "Yes," Gloria replied. "I told the doctors I tripped. Tom insisted I lie. He said no one would believe me anyway." "Was that the only time he hurt you?" "No," Gloria said, her voice trembling. "It happened more and more often. If dinner wasn't ready when he wanted it, or if CLA was too noisy, he'd throw things, yell, sometimes worse." Rivera nodded solemnly. "And how did this behavior affect CLA?" Gloria's composure cracked as tears welled in her eyes. She started walking on eggshells around him. She tried so hard to make him happy, to keep the peace, but nothing was ever enough. "Did Mr. Reed ever harm CLA directly?" Gloria shook her head. "No, but the things she saw, the things she heard, I think those hurt her just as much." Rivera allowed the silence to linger for a moment before asking her final question. "Mrs. Reed, why did you decide to speak out now?" Gloria glanced at CLA, who sat watching with wide, tear-filled eyes. "Because of her," she said, her voice steady despite her tears. "She deserves better. She deserves to grow up in a home where she feels safe." The turning point. As Gloria stepped down from the stand, Judge Hale allowed himself a brief moment to collect his thoughts. Her testimony, combined with the evidence already presented, painted a harrowing picture of life in the Reed household. But he knew the case was far from over. The prosecutor called her next witness, a neighbor who had reported disturbances. The neighbor, an elderly woman named Mrs. Calloway, recounted nights of hearing screaming, glass shattering, and doors slamming. "Your Honor," Mrs. Calloway said, her voice trembling with emotion, "I should have done more. I called the police, but I never followed up. I thought it wasn't my place to interfere. I was wrong." Her words struck a chord, not only with those present in the courtroom, but with Judge Hale himself. They served as a stark reminder of the collective responsibility to protect the vulnerable. The judge's decision. After hours of testimony and arguments, Judge Hale adjourned the court for deliberation. He returned to his chambers, his mind heavy with the weight of the case. He knew his decision would set a precedent not only for Tom Reed, but also for how similar cases might be handled in the future. When he returned to the bench, the courtroom fell silent. "Mr. Reed," he began, his voice firm, "the evidence presented today, combined with the testimony of your wife and neighbors, establishes a clear pattern of abuse and endangerment. You are hereby denied bail. Additionally, this court will issue a protective order ensuring that you have no contact with Gloria or CLA Reed until further notice." Tom's face darkened, his defiance giving way to fear. "This isn't over," he muttered, but the bailiff quickly silenced him. Judge Hale turned to Gloria and CLA, his expression softening. "Mrs. Reed, CLA, this court will ensure your safety as we move forward. You have my word." For the first time in years, Gloria felt a flicker of hope. She reached for CLA's hand, and together they left the courtroom, stepping into a future that, while uncertain, finally felt free of the shadows that had haunted them for so long. The dawn of a new chapter. The courtroom emptied slowly, the tension of the proceedings dissolving into a quiet hum of whispered conversations among the remaining officers and court staff. Gloria and CLA sat on a bench near the exit, waiting for the Protective Services representative to finalize arrangements for their temporary housing. The air felt lighter, though the scars of the past lingered like faint echoes. Judge Nathan Hale remained at the bench, gathering his notes and reflecting on the hearing. The image of Gloria standing strong in the witness box and the quiet bravery of CLA had left a deep impression on him. He knew their journey was far from over, but for the first time, they had a clear path forward, a shelter of safety. Later that evening, Gloria and CLA arrived at a transitional home, a clean and welcoming facility designed to help survivors of abuse rebuild their lives. The staff greeted them warmly, offering a small but comfortable room with 2 twin beds, fresh linens, and a table adorned with a small vase of wildflowers. CLA clung to Gloria as they entered the room, her wide eyes scanning the unfamiliar space. "Is this where we live now, Mom?" she asked, her voice tinged with both curiosity and uncertainty. Gloria knelt down, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's face. "For now, sweetheart," she said gently. "It's not forever, but it's a safe place. We'll be okay here." Marissa Carter, the social worker who had been with them throughout the day, placed a hand on Gloria's shoulder. "This is just the beginning," she said softly. "We'll help you with legal aid, counseling, and finding permanent housing. You're not alone in this." For the first time in years, Gloria allowed herself to believe those words. A visit from Judge Hale. 2 days later, as Gloria and CLA began to settle into their new routine, they were surprised by an unexpected visitor. Judge Hale, dressed in a simple gray suit rather than his judicial robe, arrived at the shelter unannounced. Marissa greeted him at the door, raising an eyebrow at his presence. "Your Honor," she said, her tone both respectful and curious. "This is unusual." Judge Hale smiled faintly, his expression softening. "I couldn't stop thinking about their case," he admitted. "I wanted to check on them, not as a judge, but as someone who cares." Marissa nodded, understanding his intent. She led him to the small common room where Gloria and CLA were sitting. CLA was engrossed in a coloring book, her pigtails bouncing as she focused on her work. Gloria looked up as Judge Hale entered, her eyes widening in surprise. "Judge Hale," she said, rising from her chair, "I didn't expect to see you here." He smiled warmly. "Please, call me Nathan," he said, motioning for her to sit. "I'm not here in any official capacity. I just wanted to see how you and CLA are doing." Gloria hesitated before sitting back down. "We're managing," she said carefully. "It's been a lot to process, but I think we're starting to adjust." Nathan nodded, his gaze shifting to CLA. "And how's CLA?" he asked, lowering his voice. "She's resilient," Gloria replied, glancing at her daughter with a mixture of pride and sadness. "But I know there's a lot she hasn't said yet." Nathan took a deep breath, leaning forward slightly. "I want you both to know that I'm here to support you in any way I can, not just in court, but beyond that. This isn't just about justice. It's about helping you rebuild." Gloria's eyes filled with tears, but this time, they were tears of gratitude. "Thank you," she said softly. "You've already done so much for us." A step toward healing. In the weeks that followed, Gloria and CLA began to attend therapy sessions at the shelter. Gloria found herself opening up about the years of abuse, releasing emotions she had buried for far too long. CLA, with the gentle guidance of a child therapist, started to process her own experiences through art and play. One day, during a particularly quiet afternoon, CLA approached Gloria with a drawing. It depicted a small girl holding the hand of a tall man in a black robe. Above them, a bright sun shone down, illuminating the scene. "Who's this?" Gloria asked, kneeling to examine the drawing. "It's me and Judge Hale," CLA said proudly. "He's like a hero. He helped us. Gloria's heart swelled as she looked at the drawing. "He did," she said softly. "But you were the real hero, CLA. You were brave enough to speak up." CLA smiled shyly, her small fingers tracing the outline of the drawing. "Do you think we'll ever see him again?" "I think so," Gloria replied. "I think he cares about us more than just as a judge." A future reimagined. Months later, Gloria stood outside a modest two-bedroom apartment, the keys clutched tightly in her hand. Thanks to the shelter's resources and the court's intervention, she had secured a stable job and a safe home for herself and CLA. As they stepped inside, CLA ran from room to room, her laughter echoing through the empty space. Gloria watched her daughter, her heart swelling with a mix of relief and joy. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of hope for the future. That evening, as they sat on the floor eating takeout pizza, a knock sounded at the door. Gloria opened it to find Nathan Hale standing there, holding a small houseplant. "I heard the good news," he said with a smile, extending the plant to her. "Every home needs a little greenery." Gloria laughed, accepting the gift. "Thank you, Nathan, for everything." He looked past her to see CLA, who waved excitedly. "Hi, Judge Hale," she called. "Hi, CLA," he replied, stepping inside. "I hope you like your new home." CLA nodded vigorously. "It's perfect," she said, "because now we're safe." Nathan smiled, his heart full as he watched the small family begin to rebuild their lives. He knew the road ahead would still have challenges, but for Gloria and CLA, the worst was behind them. And for Nathan, this case had reaffirmed his belief in the power of justice, not just as a legal concept, but as a force for true change. That evening, after Judge Hale's brief visit, Gloria sat with CLA on their living room floor, surrounded by the simple joys of unpacking. A box of toys and books, donated by shelter volunteers, sat between them. CLA eagerly pulled out a well-loved stuffed bear and hugged it tightly. "Mom," CLA asked, her voice soft, "are we really safe now?" Gloria wrapped her arms around her daughter, pulling her close. "Yes, sweetie," she said firmly. "We're safe, and we're going to stay safe." As she spoke, Gloria felt the weight of her words. They weren't just a reassurance to CLA. They were a promise to herself. For too long, she had lived in fear, believing that silence and endurance were her only options. But now, she understood that courage didn't mean enduring abuse. It meant fighting for a better future. A community of support. Over the following months, Gloria and CLA became active members of the community that had rallied around them. The shelter's staff helped Gloria enroll in a vocational training program, and she soon found a job at a local office. CLA returned to school, her days filled with the laughter and learning she had been missing. Judge Nathan Hale kept in touch, often through Marissa Carter, the social worker. He provided updates on the legal proceedings against Tom Reed, ensuring that Gloria and CLA felt informed and supported every step of the way. Tom's case had grown stronger as more evidence emerged. Additional witnesses came forward, neighbors who had previously been too afraid to speak out. Their testimonies, combined with Gloria's courage and the documented evidence, led to a swift and decisive trial. Tom was convicted on charges of domestic violence, endangerment, and DUI, receiving a sentence that included significant prison time and mandatory rehabilitation. The news brought a bittersweet sense of closure to Gloria. She felt relief knowing that Tom could no longer harm them, but she also grieved the man he had once been, the man she had loved before his anger and addiction consumed him. A celebration of freedom. On a crisp autumn afternoon, Gloria and CLA hosted a small gathering at their apartment to celebrate their new beginning. Marissa, the shelter staff, and even Judge Hale were invited. CLA had insisted on decorating the apartment with colorful paper chains and balloons, transforming the modest space into a festive haven. When Nathan arrived, carrying a wrapped gift, CLA ran to greet him. "Judge Hale," she exclaimed, her pigtails bouncing as she threw her arms around his waist. "You came," "Of course I did," he replied with a warm smile. "I wouldn't miss it." He handed her the gift, which she eagerly tore open to reveal a set of books about brave children overcoming challenges. CLA beamed, hugging the books to her chest. "Thank you." As the guests mingled, Gloria found a quiet moment with Nathan on the balcony. The golden hues of the setting sun painted the sky, and the sounds of laughter filtered through the open door. "I don't know how to thank you," Gloria said, her voice filled with emotion. "You didn't have to go above and beyond like this." Nathan shook his head. "You don't need to thank me," he said. "You and CLA did the hard part. I just did my job." Gloria smiled, her eyes glistening. "It's more than a job to you, isn't it?" He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It is. Cases like yours remind me why I do this. It's about more than laws. It's about people, about giving them a chance to reclaim their lives." Gloria looked back into the apartment, where CLA was showing off her new books to the shelter staff. "She's so happy now," she said softly. "I didn't think we'd ever have this." Nathan placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You've given her that happiness, Gloria. And you've given her something even more important, a future. A new legacy." As the evening wound down and the guests departed, Gloria and CLA sat together on the couch, the remnants of the party scattered around them. CLA was already half asleep, her head resting on Gloria's lap. For the first time in years, the silence wasn't oppressive. It was peaceful, a sign of the calm they had worked so hard to achieve. Gloria gently brushed a strand of hair from CLA's face and whispered, "We did it, baby. We're free." In the days and years that followed, Gloria and CLA continued to rebuild their lives, leaning on the strength they had discovered in each other. CLA grew into a confident young woman, her childhood scars transformed into a source of resilience and empathy. Gloria, too, flourished, finding purpose and joy in helping other survivors of abuse navigate their own paths to freedom. And for Judge Nathan Hale, the case of Gloria and CLA Reid became a touchstone, a reminder of the profound impact the justice system could have when wielded with compassion. Though he presided over countless cases in the years to come, he never forgot the courage of a small girl who dared to speak the truth in his courtroom, setting into motion a chain of events that would change both their lives forever.